How dare you touch her?
He didn't hesitate as his palm connected with her cheek, the sound of the strike echoing like a gunshot through the neon-drenched club while everyone watched. Alara didn't scream. She didn't even cry out as she collapsed onto the wet, reflective floor, her red evening gown pooling around her like a warning. She stayed down, her eyes wide with a cold calculation, as if she knew something Marcus Hale didn't. Because the moment he struck her, the heavy glass doors behind him were already swinging open, and the man walking in owned far more than the luxury club they were standing in. If this story of hidden power and instant retribution pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable journey dropping tomorrow. While you're here, jump into the comments and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing our global community. All right, let's get back into the shadows. Hey, move. The shove had come without warning. Alara stumbled sideways, her slim frame slamming into the polished mahogany of the bar. Glass rattled against the shelf, and conversation died mid-sentence as heads turned. Marcus Hale stood over her, his breath heavy with expensive scotch and an entitlement that had aged into pure cruelty. His dark suit jacket hung open, his face flushed with the kind of confidence that only comes from a life without consequences. "Still can't stay on your feet, Alara," he sneered, loud enough for the VIP lounge to hear. His voice carried that same sharp, aggressive tone she remembered from the night he had discarded her at her lowest point. "Some things never change, huh?" Alara caught herself against the wood, her palms flat, her breathing steady despite the chaos. Around her, the pulsing blue and red neon lights of the club suddenly felt like ice. People watched. A man in a tailored blazer looked away nervously, and a woman at a nearby booth whispered to her companion. The bartender froze mid-pour, his eyes darting between Marcus's hostility and Alara's unnatural calm. Marcus took a step closer, his dress shoes clicking against the damp floor. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue? Or did the world finally teach you to keep your mouth shut?" Alara straightened slowly, the silk of her red dress rustling softly. She kept her eyes down, not from the fear Marcus expected, but from the realization that his time was up. To everyone watching, she looked like a broken woman from his past. "I don't want trouble, Marcus," she said quietly. That only fueled his rage. His face twisted into something ugly, something that had been waiting years for this moment of dominance. "Trouble? You don't want trouble," he laughed, a harsh, grating sound that cut through the club's bass. Unaware of the apex protector, now standing mere feet behind him, Marcus raised his hand again. He didn't see the stone-faced men in dark suits fanning out to seal the exits, or Kang Junseok, whose perfectly tailored white shirt and dark neck tattoos signaled a storm that was about to break. The velvet rope of the VIP lounge offered no sanctuary, only a more expensive stage for Marcus Hale's cruelty. The air in the private wing was thick with the scent of sandalwood, and the low, heavy bass of the club's speakers, vibrating through the floorboards like a warning heartbeat. Alara stood near the glass balcony, her hand trembling slightly as she held a crystal flute of sparkling water, the red silk of her evening gown catching the erratic flicker of the neon signage. To any stranger, she was a vision of elegance, but to Marcus, who had just stepped into her personal space, she was merely a ghost he had once finished haunting. "Still playing dress-up, I see," Marcus sneered, his voice cutting through the ambient music with a familiar, mocking edge. He leaned against the mahogany railing, his dark suit jacket hanging open in a display of unearned confidence that Alara remembered all too well. "That red dress is a bit much, don't you think? It screams for attention you don't know what to do with." Alara didn't flinch, though the memory of his past words, the ones that used to make her shrink, threatened to resurface. She tightened her grip on her glass, her palms flat against the cold condensation as she breathed slowly through her nose. In, out, controlled. "I'm not looking for attention, Marcus. I was just enjoying my evening," she said quietly. "Enjoying it?" he laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made a nearby couple shift uncomfortably. "With what money, Alara? Last I checked, you were one step away from the street after your old man kicked the bucket." He took a step closer, his breath heavy with whiskey, his face flushed with the toxic entitlement of a man who had never faced a single consequence for the wreckage he left behind. "You were always a walking disaster," Marcus continued, his voice rising as he gestured to the room as if inviting the other patrons to witness her shame. A pathetic, weak little girl who couldn't even keep a job at a diner. I did us both a favor when I walked out on you. Elara straightened slowly, her slim frame silhouetted against the red and gold glow of the lounge's neon signs. She looked at him through her lashes, not with the fear he expected, but with a growing, cold calculation. She looked exactly like what Marcus wanted to see, someone broken. But beneath the silk, she felt the soft vibration of her phone against her hip. A single pulse. "You should leave, Marcus," she warned, her voice steady. "Or what? You'll cry?" he sneered, stepping into her immediate territory. He looked at her with an ugly satisfaction, convinced that her silence was still a symptom of her weakness rather than the calm before a storm he couldn't possibly fathom. To him, she was still the girl who had stayed down, unaware that the predator in the room was no longer the man standing in front of her. The neon pulse of the VIP lounge seemed to throb in time with the rising heat in Marcus's face, his entitlement aging into a volatile cruelty that the expensive scotch could no longer mask. He took a step closer, his dress shoes scraping against the floor as he leaned into Elara's space, his voice carrying that same mocking tone she remembered from the years that used to make her shrink. "Still can't stay on your feet, Elara," he sneered, loud enough for the patrons at the nearby tables to whisper. "Some things never change, huh? You're still a walking disaster, waiting for someone to pick up the pieces of your pathetic life." Elara straightened slowly, the red silk of her gown rustling softly as she caught herself against the polished wood of the bar counter. Her palms were flat, her breathing steady, a controlled rhythm of in and out that Marcus mistook for the paralysis of fear. To him, and to everyone watching, she looked exactly like what he wanted them to see. Someone who had been broken and stayed that way. "I don't want trouble, Marcus," she said, her voice quiet but devoid of the tremor he craved. That lack of fear only fueled him, twisting his face into something ugly and theater-like in its cruelty. He laughed, a harsh and grating sound that cut through the low bass of the jukebox. "Trouble? You don't want trouble? You are trouble. You're the dead weight I finally had the sense to cut loose." In one sudden, blurred motion, Marcus's hand came up. The slap echoed louder than the clinking of crystal or the rattle of glass, a sharp snap that caused the bartender to freeze mid-pour. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and laughter died in throats as every head in the tiger's den turned to witness the violation. Elara's head snapped to the side, her shoulder slamming into the bar as she stumbled. She went down onto one knee, her hand shooting out to catch herself against the floor, sticky with years of wear. Pain bloomed across her face, sharp and hot, but she didn't scream. She didn't beg. Marcus stood over her, chest heaving, looking down with a satisfaction written across every line of his face. "Stay down," he said, his voice dropping to a gentle, terrifying sneer. "It's where you belong." Elara lifted her head slowly, her hair falling across one eye. Through the strands, she looked at him with a gaze that wasn't fear, but a cold, lethal calculation. She knew something Marcus didn't, something nobody in that bar could possibly guess. She wasn't powerless anymore. Against her hip, her phone buzzed once, a soft, private vibration. She didn't need to look at the screen to know the three-word pattern it displayed: "On my way." The amber glow of the lounge suddenly felt like a tomb. As Marcus opened his mouth to deliver another insult, the air in the room changed, a subtle shift in pressure. Like a storm rolling in from a dark and distant horizon. The doors to the nightclub swung open with a heavy, final thud that seemed to swallow the ambient bass of the music. Conversations that had begun to resume after Marcus's strike died instantly, the air in the room turning brittle as a new, crushing pressure rolled in. 3 men entered first, moving with a disciplined, predatory silence that made every patron hold their breath. They were broad-shouldered enforcers dressed in black suits that cost more than most people's cars, their faces carved from stone, and their eyes scanning the room with professional detachment. Park Min-yi, his jaw set like granite, fanned out to the left, while the massive Choi Di-hyun moved to the right, his hands hanging loose at his sides like weapons waiting to be deployed. They moved in a synchronized formation, securing the perimeter with a lethality that needed no explanation. Then came Kang Junseok. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit with a white dress shirt open at the collar, he moved with the unhurried grace of a man who owned the very ground he stood upon. But it was the tattoos that arrested the eye, dark ink crawling up his neck like warnings written in a language everyone understood, but nobody dared speak aloud. Serpents and geometric shadows promised a violence that was absolute and permanent. The crowd, previously gathered in a morbid circle to watch Alara's humiliation, parted like a red sea. People stumbled backward, knocking over chairs and spilling drinks in their haste to get out of his path. Junseok's eyes, cold and calculating, swept the room once before locking onto Alara, who was still on one knee upon the reflective floor. In that moment, everything else in the club, the neon lights, the shimmering bar, the terrified witnesses ceased to exist. Marcus, his smirk still frozen in a mask of fatting bravado, turned toward the intrusion. His face, flushed with alcohol and the kind of confidence that comes from never facing consequences, began to crack at the edges. "What the hell is this?" he blurted out, his voice climbing an octave in an attempt to reclaim his dominance. "Some kind of rescue squad." Junseok didn't answer. He crossed the floor with measured steps, the glass from a shattered bottle crunching under his expensive leather shoes with a sound that echoed louder than the heartbeat of the room. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't even acknowledge the man's existence. Instead, he reached Alara and knelt beside her, his movements possessing a gentleness that stood in terrifying contradiction to the lethal aura radiating from his frame. "Talk to me," he said quietly. His voice was low, controlled, and almost tender, yet it carried the weight of a storm about to break. Alara looked up, her curly hair disheveled and her face pale, catching the amber glow of the lights through the strands. Something private passed between them, a silent communication of certainty that made the air feel charged with electricity. Marcus laughed, but the sound was thin and uncertain now. "What is this? You her new boyfriend?" Junseok stood slowly, turning to face Marcus with a terrifying stillness. He adjusted his cuffs with deliberate care, his dark eyes fixing on Marcus like a surgeon assessing a tumor. When he finally spoke, his voice was as soft as silk and as sharp as broken glass. "My wife." The word crushed the room. It hung in the air like the smoke after a gunshot, settling over Marcus's slackened face as the realization of his mistake began to bleed the color from his skin. The word wife hung in the air like heavy smoke after a gunshot, crushing the room into a suffocating silence. Marcus's face went slack for a moment, his hand shaking slightly as he gestured at Alara with a dismissive mockery that was rapidly losing its conviction. "Wife! Her!" he blurted out, his voice cracking as he looked toward the stone-faced enforcers flanking the entrance. "Did you pick her up at some charity event?" Junseok didn't respond to the bait. Instead, he extended his hand to Alara, helping her to her feet with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone carved from stone and violence. As she stood, he draped his perfectly tailored black jacket over her shoulders. The fabric still held the warmth of his body, and for the first time in 5 years, Alara didn't feel exposed or invisible. She felt protected by a shield of armor that Marcus could never pierce. Alara met Marcus's eyes through the strands of her hair, but there was no fear in her gaze now, only a lethal certainty. She straightened slowly, the red silk of her gown rustling softly beneath Junseok's jacket. She knew what Marcus didn't, that his entitlement had finally led him into a trap where his confidence meant nothing and his status was a liability. Junseok stood slowly, his tall frame filling the space between Alara and the man who had dared to strike her. He adjusted his cuffs with deliberate, rhythmic care, his movements carrying the kind of silence that made the entire room hold its breath. When he finally turned his full attention to Marcus, his dark eyes were cold and calculating, assessing the man like a surgeon looks at a tumor, something to be removed, not reasoned with. "You made a choice tonight," Junseok said. His voice was soft as silk and sharp as broken glass, vibrating through the amber glow of the lounge with the weight of absolute certainty. "You chose violence against someone you thought was powerless. You thought there would be no consequences because you didn't know who she belonged to." Marcus stepped back, his expensive dress shoes scraping against the floorboards as he hit a bar stool, nearly toppling it. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, his face pale under the harsh red and gold neon light. "I didn't know," Marcus whispered, his voice climbing an octave in desperation. I didn't know she was married to. That is your defense, Junseok interrupted, his tone flat and dangerous. That you assault women as long as you don't know their husbands. He took one step closer, his measured steps echoing in the silence. In this city, every breath you take is at my discretion, and tonight you made me reconsider that allowance. Marcus collapsed against the bar, his legs giving out like a puppet with cut strings. He looked at the three enforcers positioned strategically around the room, realizing that the exits were sealed and the tiger's den had become his cage. He was no longer the predator. He was an insignificant variable in a world where silence meant death. Behind the protective shield of Junseok's jacket, Alara felt the weight of the fabric settle around her like armor, but internally, old wounds were opening. The cold amber glow of the club faded, replaced by the flickering, sterile fluorescent lights of a hospital hallway 5 years earlier. She remembered the smell of disinfectant and despair, the sound of her own voice breaking as she pressed the phone to her ear, begging for the man who claimed to love her. I need you, she had whispered into the receiver. Please, I can't do this alone. Marcus's voice had been distracted, sharp with an impatient entitlement. I'm in the middle of something. Can this wait? Her father had died 3 days later. Marcus had come to the funeral, but he stayed for only 20 minutes, disappearing before the first shovelful of earth hit the casket. When she confronted him later in the apartment he had convinced her to rent, the one he never put his name on, he didn't offer comfort. He offered a verdict. I can't be around this kind of negativity right now, he had told her, grabbing his jacket. You're dragging me down, Alara. You're just stuck. She had been sitting on the couch her father had given her, the last piece of a life that was rapidly dissolving. I just lost my dad, she had said, her voice hollow. I just need time. Marcus had laughed then, a sound devoid of humor that echoed the harshness she heard now in the club. You don't have time. You don't have a job. You don't have money. You don't have anything. He had looked at her not as a partner, but as dead weight, a walking disaster that was no longer profitable to his ego. I tried, Alara, he'd lied as he walked toward the door. God knows I tried, but I can't save someone who won't save themselves. The click of the door closing that night had echoed for months, a sound that defined her rock bottom. It was the sound of an eviction notice on the table and a funeral bill she couldn't pay. It was the sound of becoming invisible. Marcus had never asked where she went or if she survived. In his mind, her non-existence was proof that he had been right to discard her. Now, standing in the tiger's den, Alara watched Marcus cower against the bar. His face pale with the realization that the woman he thought he had erased had instead reformed into something harder. She realized that leaving her was the only kind thing he had ever done, because it had forced her to find out who she was without his mercy. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece in the shadows of the city, eventually finding a man who saw strength where Marcus saw only a burden. The silence in the bar was absolute as Alara straightened her shoulders, the warmth of Junseok's jacket grounding her in the present. The flashback receded, leaving only the clinical reality of the night's reckoning. Marcus hadn't changed at all. He was still the same coward who mistook kindness for weakness and chose cruelty to feel powerful. But tonight, the circle was finally closing. The bar doors clicked shut, a soft, metallic sound that echoed like a hammer on a nail. The three men in black suits shifted their positions with a professional detachment that made the air feel thinner, sealing away the neon lights of the street and the possibility of escape. Marcus's eyes darted toward the exits, his breathing accelerating as he found his path blocked by the massive Choi Di-hyun and the scarred Park Min-yi. Junseok moved toward the bar with measured, unhurried steps. His expensive leather shoes made almost no sound on the wooden floor despite the broken glass scattered across it, remnants of the drink Marcus had shattered earlier. He didn't look at the patrons, who sat frozen in a gallery of stunned faces, but instead focused entirely on the man cowering against the mahogany counter. You chose this place tonight because you thought it was neutral ground, Junseok began, his voice soft as silk and sharp as broken glass. He adjusted his cuffs with deliberate care, the dark serpents and geometric shadows on his neck shifting in the amber glow of the tiger's den. You saw a woman you believed was alone, and your instinct was to make her feel small to feed your own ego. You mistook kindness for weakness and silence for surrender. Marcus tried to speak, his throat working as he swallowed hard against the rising bile of terror. I didn't know. I didn't understand who she was with. That is the core of your failure, Junseok interrupted, his tone carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Ramon Molina, the name you likely know me by in the Southern Corridor, has rules. Rule 1 is respect for the hierarchy. Rule 2 is honoring the code. But the third rule is the only one that matters tonight. Family is sacred. He leaned in closer, his dark eyes devoid of mercy, locking Marcus into a gaze that felt like a surgical assessment. Ilara is my family. She is the one who survived a past designed to destroy her, and in doing so, she became the anchor of my world. When you struck her, you didn't just insult a woman, you violated the territory of my empire. Marcus's face had gone completely slack, sweat beading on his forehead, as the clinical reality of his situation settled in. He looked like a puppet with cut strings, sliding down the bar until his legs barely supported him. In my world, Junseok continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the hushed room, we do not negotiate with infections. We remove them. You walked into this club as a man with a past, but you will leave it as a tumor, a mistake that must be excised to ensure the health of the body. He snapped his fingers once, a sound that was sharp and final. The enforcers moved as one, their steps synchronized as they closed the distance, their stone-faced silence a promise that the message had been received and the sentence was about to be carried out. The three enforcers didn't rush. They moved with a disciplined, professional detachment that made the air in the tiger's den feel heavy and final. Marcus stumbled backward, his dress shoes scraping against the wooden floor until he hit a bar stool, nearly toppling it in his desperation to find an escape route that didn't exist. Junseok raised one hand, and the men stopped mid-step like statues given temporary life. The waiting, the anticipation, and the knowledge that they would move only when commanded was a psychological weight that made Marcus's face go pale with horror. Not yet, Junseok said quietly, his tone flat and clinical. He removed his jacket, folded it with deliberate care, and draped it over a bar stool, revealing the dark tattoos snaking up his forearms, warnings written in ink and scar tissue. He stepped into the makeshift arena carved from old wood and broken glass, his presence filling the room with the unhurried grace of an apex predator. You want to know the difference between us? Junseok asked, his voice soft as silk and sharp as broken glass. When you hurt Ilara, you did it to feel powerful. When I hurt you, I do it to teach a lesson. Junseok moved like water, fluid, inevitable, and impossible to stop. He didn't use wild, angry swings. His violence was measured and precise. The first punch was a sharp jab to Marcus's solar plexus that doubled him over, gasping as all air evacuated his lungs in a single whoosh. The enforcers, Ernesto and Leo, hauled him back to his feet, forcing him upright so he could receive the next concentrated dose of reality. Each strike was calculated to cause maximum pain without causing death. Ribs, stomach, kidneys, the soft meat of the thighs. The sound of flesh on flesh and Marcus's raw, primal screams echoed off the walls, bouncing back to multiply in the hushed space where 19 people watched in horrified fascination. Junseok was teaching him the same lesson Marcus had tried to teach Ilara, the crushing reality of what it feels like when someone decides you don't matter. After several minutes of clinical execution, Junseok stepped back, his knuckles split and smeared with a mixture of blood. He wasn't even breathing hard as he pulled out a white handkerchief to clean his hands. Marcus hung between the enforcers like wet laundry, his face a mask of blood and tears, his arrogance pummeled out of him onto the sticky bar floor. Look at her, Junseok commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Ernesto grabbed a handful of Marcus's hair and yanked his head up, forcing his swelling eyes to find Ilara, who stood exactly where she had been, draped in her husband's armor. You're still breathing, Junseok said, his gaze as cold as stone. That's mercy. Do you understand? Every breath you take right now is a gift I'm choosing to give you. He turned to Ilara, a silent question in his eyes, offering her the final word in the closing of a circle that should have been closed years ago. Diana walked forward, each step deliberate, her boots crunching on the broken glass that littered the makeshift arena. Even broken and hanging between the enforcers, Marcus was physically larger than her, but height carried no weight in the silence of the tiger's den. She stopped an arm's length away, close enough for Marcus to see the woman she had become, the hardness in her eyes he didn't recognize, and a calm he couldn't comprehend. Marcus stared up at her, his face a distorted mask of blood and fear, his left eye swelling shut under the amber glow of the neon lights. "Do you remember what you said to me?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the hushed bar. "The day you left." Marcus's mouth worked, but no words came, his breath hitching in ragged, ugly sobs. Alara didn't wait for an answer. "You said I was dragging you down. You said I was stuck in my grief and that you couldn't save someone who wouldn't save themselves." She paused, letting the memory of his cruelty hang in the air like smoke. "But you were right about one thing, Marcus. I was stuck. I was stuck in the belief that I needed a coward like you to survive." Marcus's eyes darted between Alara and Junseok, looking for a sliver of forgiveness that did not exist. "Alara, he started, but she cut him off with a gaze of absolute certainty. "You didn't leave because I was weak," she said, leaning in so only he could hear the steel underneath her words. "You left because my strength in the face of loss terrified you. You saw someone who could lose everything and still breathe, and it reminded you of how small you really are." Marcus's face crumpled, the last of his arrogant facade dissolving into a confession he had spent 5 years running from. "You left because you were scared," Alara continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed like an executioner's blade. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you left because of my negativity, and not because you were a coward who couldn't handle the weight of real life." Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, and finally his head lolled forward in a gesture of total defeat. "I was scared," he choked out, the words mangled by his split lip and shattered pride. "I couldn't handle it. I was too weak to stay." The admission landed with more finality than any physical blow Junseok had delivered. Alara straightened, the borrowed jacket still draped over her shoulders like armor, her expression shifting to something more complicated, recognition, and then a profound, settling peace. "I accept your apology," she said, looking down at the man who had once been her entire world. "But accepting it doesn't mean forgiving you. It just means I'm letting go of the weight of thinking I deserved what you did. I'm done." She turned her back on him, returning to Junseok's side as the enforcers waited for the final command to erase the ghost of Marcus Hale once and for all. Junseok reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, cheap key on a generic ring, tossing it into Marcus's lap where he sat slumped against the base of the bar. "Blue sedan at the end of the alley," Junseok stated with the cold, matter-of-fact tone of a businessman concluding a final transaction. "Registration and title are in the glove box, and there's $500 in the console. Drive east and don't stop until you hit the ocean." Marcus stared at the keys as if they were a venomous snake, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. Junseok crouched down one last time, his voice dropping to a whisper that was colder than the damp alley air outside. "If you ever come back, if you ever speak her name again, or even look in the direction of this city, the mercy ends." He didn't need to elaborate. The presence of the enforcers and the blood on his own knuckles spoke for him. "Next time, there won't be witnesses or a floor to collapse on. There will just be your name on a missing persons report that gets forgotten." A shudder ran through Marcus's broken body as he gave a jerky, mechanical nod of understanding. Junseok stood and offered his arm to Alara, her hand looking small and elegant in the crook of his elbow. Together, they walked away from Marcus without looking back, leaving him to be dragged toward the rear exit by the enforcers. In the doorway, Alara paused for a final moment, pulling out a worn photograph, the last thing he had ever given her, and tearing it into pieces that fluttered to the floor like snow. "Now you're gone," she said quietly. "Completely." The black luxury sedan idled at the curb, its engine a soft, expensive purr that contrasted with the violent silence they left behind. As the car wound away from the neon flicker of the club and up into the sleeping hills, the city lights became a distant, glittering tapestry. Inside the quiet cabin, Junseok didn't ask if she was okay. He simply took her hand, his bruised knuckles a silent testament to the protection he provided. They arrived at a home of glass and light, a sanctuary where Marcus's ghost had never walked. Standing before the panorama of the city she had once fled in ruins, Alara watched her reflection in the glass. She looked tired and quiet, but for the first time in 5 years, she looked whole. "He thought he left me with nothing," she whispered as Junseok stood behind her, his solid form a wall against the world. But nothing is a good place to start. When you have nothing, you get to choose what you build. And I built myself. The storm was finally over, leaving a peace that was not empty, but full of everything she had survived and everything she no longer had to carry. As the dawn began to lighten the edge of the sky, Alara laced her fingers through her husband's, finally home, finally loved, and never once looking back.